If you're listening to this podcast, which clearly you are, you've been there. The first time someone refers to you as the mom and you think, Mom, that's my mom's name. It's the moment you realize that you're actually the one in charge, the one that's supposed to answer and ask the questions at the doctor's appointment, the one that makes the rules, the one that says, because I said so, that's why. You've joined one of the biggest clubs in the whole world, a club in which we all have the same first name. A trip to the park will never be the same. But even though you've entered into this huge sorority, you feel like the same person you've always been. The title doesn't endow you with instantaneous enlightenment or wisdom, and yet you're not the same. You look different, you spend your time differently, you can no longer come and go as you please without making sure someone is watching the baby. Your workload and responsibilities have increased exponentially. You can't even think like you used to because you're so sleep deprived. You've entered that phone booth and come out again with an augmented identity. From now on, whether you wear the jeans or not, you're the mom. This is the How She Moms podcast with Whitney Archibald. I'm a mother of 5 on a mission to help moms connect with your kids, manage your homes, and create your own unique version of motherhood. I curate ideas from different moms so you can pick and choose what works for you and your family. Before we get too deep into this episode, I want to introduce you to a new sponsor for the show, Smart for Life. When I was a busy teenager, I remember wishing there was a magic pill I could take to replace a meal on those days I just didn't have time to sit down and eat. Luckily, by the time I became a busy mom, protein bars were invented for those times when you just have to eat on the go. Now that I'm well into motherhood, bars have come a long way. I've tried them all, and I'm so happy to have discovered a new go-to bar, Smart for Life. My 15-year-old son and I were searching for a bar that was filling, gluten-free, uses ingredients we can pronounce, and most importantly, was not loaded with sugar. He eats his as a pick-me-up after workouts, and I usually end up eating one to replace either breakfast or lunch while I'm out and about, or when I just realize I forgot to eat, as moms often do. Smart for Life also sells cookies, shakes, soups, and other products. If you'd like to give them a try, head to smartforlife.com and use the code HowSheMoms with no spaces to get a 10% discount off your order. We all enter motherhood with an idea of what a mom with a capital M is supposed to be like. This mom is a composite of what we hope we'll be like, what our own mother was like, the other mothers we know, and cultural expectations. For our generation, this mom image also includes a fictional social media mom made up of all the best parts of all the moms. For past generations, it included TV moms who did laundry in heels with a knowing smile. Piecing together our new identity requires us to both deconstruct this mythical mom and construct our own unique version of mom. I consider Rebecca Brown Wright as something of a prodigy in this department because she started deconstructing right away.
I looked around to other mothers to see what they were doing, and I had a lot of strong and opinionated mothers surrounding me and telling me what a mother does. And so I tried to do what they did, and a lot of it was housekeeping. A lot of it was, when you're a mother, you should have these types of meals prepared, and you should have your house kept in this certain way. And so I was waking up early when I had just a 3-week-old, and, that's a stage where you're not getting any sleep. And I was waking up early and making a hot breakfast for my husband at like 5:30 in the morning, because I just thought that's what you're supposed to do. I thought that's what motherhood was. And so that was a hard transition. And then just being the sole caretaker of this little being was really hard for me as well. And so I quickly shed the housekeeping expectations, because it didn't work for me. It was just too much pressure on myself. So once I shed that and just stopped caring about it and brought my husband into it with me instead of me taking it all on, then I was able to have a much happier motherhood. But I really had to separate those two things, that housekeeping and that motherhood. And after that, I was able to really soak it up and enjoy it and love it. But it was only once I discarded other people's expectations that I was able to do that. Because I was like, why am I waking up at 5:30 in the morning when I haven't slept all night because I have a newborn? It was probably at a moment when he'd gone to work, and I was crying in the shower because I just thought this was going to be my life, like rushing around to feed my husband and feed my child and get the house clean. And it just was so depressing. And I just thought, this doesn't have to be my life. My life does not have to be about cleaning and cooking unless I want it to be. And so, yeah, it was very early on. I just thought I'm not making hot breakfast anymore, and I just started to slowly shed responsibilities. And I mean, it took years to figure out the right balance, but I think changing that mentality that this isn't my job to make our house run well. It's my husband and my job to make our house run well, and that this isn't my motherhood to make our house run well. Shedding that at about 4 weeks into motherhood, and then slowly figuring it out over time.
Rebecca wrote a great article about this called Housekeeping is Not Motherhood, which will pop up immediately when you Google it. She also talks about this realization and many other wise parenting epiphanies on her new podcast, Pause and Connect. Like Rebecca, Hannah Olson, who currently has 4 children 5 and under, and runs a great Instagram account, Freckled Han, has been able to disconnect her identity as a mom from the work that goes along with it.
I think that one of the reasons why I was able to enjoy that process more was because I didn't view all the things I was doing all the time as motherhood. I feel like when we're saying motherhood is hard, usually we're referring to things that I think are outside of that scope of motherhood. And I think more recently I've defined it as motherhood is a relationship, because I think that's a little bit more clear.
Yeah.
So when you just think of motherhood as the relationship itself, then things like doing the laundry, making meals, sweeping the floor, taking kids to and from school, those things are things that we do for our kids, yes, but those aren't actually motherhood. And it seems like more often than not, when people are saying motherhood is hard, they're referring to not getting good sleep or breastfeeding or disciplining or things like that, which again, you might be doing some of those things for the sake of the relationship, but the relationship is going to exist regardless of whether you are doing those things. And then once Lydia was born, it was like, well, yeah, not having sleep is hard, and diaper blowouts 10 times a day, or, whatever. Like, yes, these things are hard. But first of all, I didn't see those things as motherhood, but also I was fully expecting those things. It was the relationship, the bond, the idea that like life was now bigger than me and Steven was what made it so amazing, I guess. And I mean, even just realizing, oh, God knows what he's doing. like there's a reason why we are encouraged to have children and to grow our families, is because it is hard to understand that relationship without experiencing it.
This new relationship, like our other relationships as daughter, sister, wife, and friend, is a big part of this elusive thing we call our identity. And because it's so new and so big, it kind of takes over for a while and can temporarily push out other parts of our identity, like our hobbies and interests, our career goals, and even some of our other relationships. Devin Smitty explains it well.
My transition into motherhood felt like really hard for all of the standard and surface level things that are hard, like the exhaustion and the, all the just anxiety that goes around with like caring for a little human for the first time, all of that. And I felt like, and I had this added thing of imploding my identity, and who I'd always thought of as myself for like the last 2 decades. But really, like in hindsight, and the longer I've been a mother and the more women I've talked to, I've realized like that's true for everybody. Yeah. And it might not look like ending a career, making a massive career change. But I think that in so many ways, first-time moms are like called to almost die to their former selves in a million small but really meaningful ways. And that matters. And like, I don't think people slow down and talk about that. Like our culture doesn't spend a lot of time honoring that. And that's why I think the transition can be so hard for women. It's like, I didn't know it would be like this, and I didn't know that that's normal. Like that's a normal feeling. I think like as a new mom, there's so much happening in your mind that feels like, gosh, is it just me that's struggling so much with this? Why does this feel so hard for me? And we don't realize that becoming a new mom, whether it's through birth or surrogacy or adoption or whatever just totally changes every aspect of your life. And that's how it's supposed to be. Like, that's
Right.
not because you're doing it wrong, or that's, because you didn't have a good enough plan or something going into it. That's just how it is. And I think before I was a parent, I thought that having kids would be adding something to my life, like to my existing life. Like, I thought, this will just supplement all parts of who I was before, but all of that would still be the same and still exist as it did before. But really, it's like all of that being deconstructed and you having to rebuild it with like totally new building materials that you've never worked with before. And that's hard, especially when you're caring for a newborn simultaneously. You're sleep deprived and you didn't know it was going to be like that, So you're second guessing everything and feeling really like, I don't know what happened here. This wasn't what I thought it was going to be like.
Devin is a mom of 2 young children and a parenting coach with Megan Thompson Coaching. I think the reason this change to motherhood can feel so drastic from an identity standpoint is that it kind of takes us back in evolutionary time to survival mode, where all you have time for is taking care of basic needs like food, sleep, and keeping yourself and your baby alive. Taking care of this new baby kind of expands to consume all your time, so it can feel like all the other parts of your life are just gone. This is why maternity leave is not a luxury but essential. No one in survival mode can afford time to paint a masterpiece, orchestrate a marketing initiative, or write an epic novel. There's not a lot of opportunities to experience flow when you're taking care of a baby. Sarah Brinton talked about this when I asked her about her transition to motherhood.
So one of the things I've grieved the most about motherhood is the loss of the ability to feel flow. That like I spent so many years practicing being in moments in which I could focus on something, and then time passed disproportionate to my experiencing of that time passing. And I would come out of writing a paper or reading a book or planning a lesson or even teaching a lesson, and time would have passed differently than it felt. And I'd be like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that so much time went by. And then I enter young motherhood, and that just died. I never experienced that again. Never. And I had learned, this is just me, who knows if this is true, but I feel like I had learned to drink from that kind of time passing, that sense of rejuvenation I got from being focused and out of this time and place on something. And then all of a sudden I went into a world in which every single second, tick, 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 of all day long, every day, including the nights. Even sleep became a different thing, right? Because it was so intermittent. I lost all, I felt like I was cut off from the breast of nourishing focus.
Sarah Brinton is the mother of 4 young children, a lawyer, and the founder of Elect Women Utah, an organization that encourages women to run for political office. It's easy to succumb to the myopia of this new baby fog and feel like you will never again experience flow or have time to do any of the things you love to do. And if you're not doing the things that have become part of your identity, who even are you? The answer is, you are still the same person you've always been, with the same talents, interests, skills, and personality. And although sacrifice is a fundamental component of motherhood, usually starting with surrendering control of our bodies for 9 months, it's important that we don't completely sacrifice our former selves to this new identity. This prospect terrified Nancy Davis Coe as she approached motherhood.
I was pregnant with my older daughter, and I remember a family friend took me aside and said, this is going to be the most important and the most meaningful thing that you ever do, and your whole life before this will seem like a waste because this is going to be so important. And she left, and I sobbed and sobbed and sobbed because I was like, I like my life. I like traveling and doing language and all that stuff. And I think she was wrong. I think it was a really, being a mother has been an amazing part of my life, but I think what I don't like about that line of reasoning is that it is so hurtful to people who want to have families and can't.
Yeah.
And it's so degrading to women who have big lives and make room in those big lives for being a devoted mom. And suddenly that's the only thing you're judged for. So I hope that my family would tell you that they think that they are my top priority. I've certainly tried to make that the case, but I never wanted to give everything up. I never wanted to to be a mom and nothing else. I had a lot of other ideas of what I could do. And I think becoming a mom to daughters made it especially important to me that I kept, a foot in the work world, a foot in my creative pursuits, because I want my girls to grow up and feel that they are deserving of that kind of balance, that they can access all the wonderful benefits of being a mom and all the ways that enriches your life. But that doesn't mean they have to give up every single other thing.
Nancy is the host of the award-winning podcast Midlife Mixtape for the years between being hip and breaking one. I love Nancy's perspective on this, especially coming from someone whose kids are grown. The truth is, every mom has a big life, a whole life that includes the time before kids, the time with kids at home, and the time after. I did a whole episode back in 2019 about rediscovering our interests and hobbies as moms. It's number 6, Mom's Secret Identity. And we'll talk more about career choices and motherhood in the third and final episode in this series about the transition to motherhood, but I'd also like to touch on it briefly in this episode. As Nancy discussed, the career and jobs we choose are often a big part of who we are, our interests, our talents, and our sense of fulfillment and value. Joy Chantry, who blogs at joysfunstuff.com, talks about her transition from working full-time to becoming a stay-at-home mom.
I think the hardest transition for me was having one kid. Having one kid was such a huge switch because suddenly there was no praise. There was no, my excitement for the day was cleaning the toilet, and no one's patting you on the back for that or telling you what a great job you did. That was a really hard transition for me to go from being in the workforce and getting lots of interaction to just being at home with limited interaction.
Maris Young, host of the Young Honest Mother podcast, had a similar experience. When her son was about 15 months old,
I had this realization that my life would never be the same, and like the same as it was before I had him. And it sent me into a really depressive spiral where I didn't know who I was anymore. I looked in the mirror, and at this point I had left my full-time job, and I realized that I had identified as my career. And so when my career was not in the picture anymore, I was left trying to figure out where I was going to get my value from. I felt so much value wrapped up in like my salary and the job description and the colleagues that I had in the office, all of these different things. And when those things were not there anymore, from my own choosing, I decided to step back and focus on my son. And then I realized, wow, who am I? I don't know, but this feels so foreign to me that I wish I could go back in time. And that tension really dragged me down for like a good year. And every day it felt like an uphill battle, just having those thoughts and that feeling of wanting to return to how things used to be, but not being able to. Plus then having a child who is extremely intense and his personality is very much in opposition to my own. I've had to learn so many things, but I think what stands out in this moment as I'm on the tail end of that, or like coming out of that depression and realizing that, it's okay that my life is never going to be the same. Now I have an opportunity to learn things that I wouldn't have learned had I not become a mother. And there's a part of me, a pretty strong part, if I'm honest, that likes, the self-centered, the selfish way that I was before, because I, could more easily be in control of getting things exactly how I wanted them. And having a child introduces a lot of disruptions and a lot of starts and stops into my life that I would most of the time would rather not be there. But it also is helping me to become a much more flexible person, much more tolerant person, someone who is okay with people being who they are.
These are hard things to grapple with, what our careers are going to look like with this new person in the picture. The common denominator is that this transition to motherhood, which can last a long time, is an intense period of growth, which we all know almost always involves a certain amount of pain and struggle. But of course, we come out the other end stronger, and ideally, the struggle helps us to understand ourselves and our identity better. One of the hardest parts of this process is examining some of the parts of our identity and behavior that we're not so proud of. Suddenly, our behavior has the potential to influence this little child, and we start evaluating what we actually want to pass down. Here's Ashley Brown.
It taught me a lot about myself too, and it also helped me as far as being able to uncover some things about myself that I was like, I need to change these things. Like my daughter really did that. One of those things was really just in my mood sometimes. It was just like the self-development of like, you got to get more control of your emotions in order to teach her how to have control of her emotions. And that like put me on that trajectory, having her, which has been such a beautiful experience because I've learned more about myself and like things that have, I've learned in childhood that haven't been of benefit to me in my adult life, and not wanting to, I wanted to break that pattern in my family and wanting to, do better for my daughters. And so that is, the identity piece has been huge for me in my transition to motherhood.
Ashley is the founder of Routine and Things, products and workshops to help moms establish routines. She also hosts a podcast by that name. I love Ashley's positive perspective. In so many ways, motherhood helps us understand ourselves more deeply and really enhances our identity. Brooke Romney, one of my favorite writers and author of the book I Like Me Anyway, Embracing Imperfection, Connection in Christ, also found this to be true.
In the beginning, I actually mothered for the first year, 3,000 miles away from family with not a lot of friends and almost no one in my exact same stage. And that was a very interesting stage of motherhood. There was no Google or Pinterest or Instagram, so nothing. So that was a really like self-reflective stage of motherhood. I read a lot of books. I watched a lot of TV to kind of figure out like what I could do with my house. And so it was, I'm sure in the moment it was frustrating a lot, and I remember feeling lonely a lot. But it was a really great time for me to just kind of discover what I liked about it and what I was good at and what I wanted to work on.
Whitney Thomas felt like being a military spouse prepared her for the identity shift when she became a mother.
I kind of had an identity issue when Drew joined the Army. Like that was the first thing that happened. Was I moved into this world where people meet you and they ask you what your husband does. Nobody asks you about you initially. They're like, oh, what does your husband do? Because it's what puts you in context, right? Like it puts you in context of like, are you my husband's boss? Are you my husband's peer? Do you work with my husband? Like, that is the reason people are asking. But I was just kind of like, well, why are we talking about him? Like, I am fun and smart and educated, and like, why are we talking about him? He's not even here. Let's talk about us. Like, let's just talk, And so that was really hard for my identity, I guess, to immediately be like, what does your husband do? And so I feel like that was kind of a good prep to move into motherhood of whose mom are you? Like, because I don't know, it kind of like brought my ego down a little bit, I guess.
Then, also because of Army life, when Whitney did become a mother, she made the transition mostly alone. I haven't been sharing birth stories in these transition episodes because that's a whole other topic, but this is a good one, so I'm going to let Whitney tell it.
So he was gone for 10 months. And so, I mean, it's not like it was an accident or I didn't know, or, you know what I mean? Like I was able to prepare myself. But at the same time, I had 2 miscarriages. And so I had kind of had the lesson of like, there's not a good time. I just want a live baby. That was kind of my perspective at that point, was just like, I just want a healthy, alive baby. So if I have to do it alone, or if I have to, it kind of shifted my perspective of when was convenient for me or what I wanted. So we had moved to Colorado while I was pregnant, and he signed into work and found out he was deploying like within a few weeks. And so I was like integrating into a new community. I didn't know anyone, and he like left. But I mean, the one thing that is really amazing is I have amazing parents, and I knew that my mom would come and be with me and things like that. So the biggest thing that was a concern for me up to having the baby is I was more worried about the things like, am I going to be alone? Am I going to go into labor early? Am I, is she going to be here? So those were a lot more of the anxieties at that point. I don't know that I was so much worried about once he was here. It was just kind of like getting him here. And, it was neat how everything worked out. I mean, like my mom was there, and Drew was kind of just guessing of when he was going to take his 2-week R&R. And he, like the Royal Commandos, the British Royal Commandos, put him in the back of a of a tank, and they like took him out of Iraq and into Kuwait so that he could fly home. And I mean, we have like this really neat story of how he came home, and he hadn't written down his parents' phone number, and I did not have reception in the hospital, and I already knew that, and he knew that he was supposed to know his parents' phone number, so that was how he was going to get a hold of me. And so he was sitting in the Dallas airport like, oh my gosh, I did not bring the phone number. And there was a guy next to him that was like, what's wrong? And he was like, my wife is like she's like in labor, because I had gone into labor as he's coming home, and I don't know how I'm gonna get a hold of her. And he's like, oh, my wife's a labor and delivery nurse at Evans Community Hospital in Fort Carson. So when they arrived in Colorado, they drove him to the hospital and used her little pass to get him in the back. And so I had Austin at 3:30 in the afternoon, and I hadn't even left the labor until they had cleaned up, and Drew walks in and like 5. So like an hour and a half later, he like walks in, gets a great picture, and so he was home for like 2 weeks. So that was great. And that was fun. And then it was really hard because, for him to leave. When he first deployed, he didn't know what he was going into, but the second time he did. And he was leaving us behind. So that was really hard and really sad for him especially, I think. But as far as the transition to motherhood, I think for me, like I had worked when we lived at our prior duty station, and I knew everybody on the installation. Everybody knew me, the general, and all of like the commanders. Like I knew everybody. And then when we moved to Fort Carson, I didn't work. So I was like this random nobody, and my husband had gone. And so for me, I almost feel like it was a gift when Austin was finally born, because I like had someone to hang out with and like had some sort of like purpose, I guess. Because I had felt just so like, what am I doing here? But he was kind of just my buddy. Like looking back, I'm like, he was just like, I just had kind of this buddy.
I'm just so grateful for all the military families who sacrifice so much at such critical times in their own lives to serve our country. And clearly, the whole family is serving and making sacrifices. Whitney now has 4 children and is also a relationship coach. Age and experience definitely plays a role in the way motherhood impacts identity. Like Whitney, Jacqueline Johnson didn't experience much of a jolt to her identity when she became a mom.
I got married when I was 26. I didn't have her till like a year later. I mean, not that I was old. That's not old by any means. But I'd already gone to school. I finished school. I had worked. I'd had a career job, as a teacher. I traveled to Europe, not a ton, but a little. And I don't know, like I'd done the experiences I wanted to do before I became a mom. So that wasn't a transition that was hard at all. And I feel like it's because I was at the right age, the right time for me. Yeah. I could see how if you get married young or have a child young, it would be a harder transition because you just don't have as much time to yourself. I had a lot of time to myself. As being single for a while, living on my own, I'd had those experiences. So I didn't have like a hard transition as far as like bringing another person into my group.
My experience was kind of similar. Because of several years of infertility, I had lots of time to meet my career goals as a magazine writer and then editor before we finally got pregnant through in vitro. Pretty much all my friends were already moms, and I was ready and eager to add this motherhood piece to my identity. Like Sarah, I also really missed that feeling of flow, but I learned to adapt by peppering my day with small sips of the things I love to do, like reading books during those long and frequent breastfeeding sessions, singing my favorite songs to my son, and playing the piano. And though I stepped down as the editor of a monthly magazine, I remained the editor of a quarterly magazine, working mostly from home and with a lighter travel schedule. Since those early days of motherhood, my identity has evolved and developed, especially as my kids have grown and become more independent and my caregiving workload has decreased. For one thing, I've been able to make more room for my own talents and interests, like starting this podcast. And as my parenting has become less about taking care of my kids' physical needs and more about taking care of their emotional needs and teaching them skills and values, I've been able to clarify my own values and purpose. Even though this episode is about the beginning of motherhood, I wanted to end by talking a little about these later stages because I think it's helpful to realize from the beginning that this all-consuming new role will change throughout your life, and that it's so important to check in with yourself and your identity all along the way. I've talked to too many women who have let motherhood expand to overtake all other interests and relationships, including their marriages and their relationships with themselves. Then suddenly they find themselves with an empty nest and nothing to fill it with. They've given up all their interests, hobbies, and ambitions, and they don't know what to do with themselves. Not so for Georgia Anderson, a mother of 4 children and 3 stepchildren and a parenting coach at georgiaandersoncoaching.com. I asked Georgia what it was like when her children all left home.
Oh, it was so easy. I was like, bye. Yeah, and not that it didn't tug at my heartstrings. I mean, there were definitely tears when they made the final cut, and walked out the door, because you've shared so much together and you've had so much suffering and joy and all the in between together. There was so much of that. There was definitely a need to shift my perspective and my energy towards something. But I tried to do that as my children grew. Like when, I became a hiking fanatic, kind of when my kids were moving more toward junior high. And I thought, what do I need to renew myself now? Because those early years, you are giving. And I wanted to renew myself, and I just had to experiment with different ways to renew myself and to resurrect the me, or find the new me that was in there after the experience of motherhood. I became more fully myself when my kids left, and a new me that didn't exist before, because I'd walked this path with these kids.
Thank you for listening to the How She Moms podcast. If you like it, tell a friend. The bigger the community, the more ideas. There are lots of ways you can add your ideas to the How She Moms community. We have a Facebook group where we share ideas about upcoming topics and help each other solve problems we're facing in motherhood. You can also follow How She Moms on Instagram for quick tips and ideas. And you can go to howshemoms.com where you'll find transcripts of episodes and lots of other great resources. Special thanks to my mom, Susan Singley, for recording my theme music. She played this song all the time when I was growing up, and to me, it's the soundtrack of motherhood.